They say good farmers don't grow plants, they grow soil. And if you're talking about growing soil, you're most likely talking about compost. That sweet, precious noun that is also sort of a verb. The controlled decay of the old and unwanted into something rich and decadent. Hi, I'm an idiot in the Guardian. This is my compost pile. He's a Guardian. So what even is compost? At the most basic level, it's your yard garbage recycled into precious usable soil. It's the circle of life. It's the wheel of fortune. Compost is like a superfood for plants, but instead of being a marketing ploy to get you to buy spirulina, it truly is the most beneficial thing you can do for your soil's body and the health of your plants. The great laws of thermodynamics teach us that if we take energy away, we're going to have to put it back in if we want to keep growing. Traditionally, in Western cultured farms, we have been putting this energy back into our soils with the use of fertilizers. This is a very simplistic explanation of what is going on, but believe me when I say that we have come to find out that scientifically generated fertilizers used over time will absolutely decimate your native soils into useless dust or compacted clay. Compost, on the other hand, is all natural. It eliminates landfill waste and greenhouse gases. Like, did you know a family that composts diverts almost 30% of their total household waste from a landfill compared to a family that doesn't compost? There are many reasons to start making some compost at home. Compost improves your soil structure. If you have bad soil, compost adds the needed loam to retain moisture and nutrients. Compost attracts beneficial organisms, reducing the need for chemical pesticides or fertilizers. Adding compost back into soil will help reduce soil erosion. It sequesters carbon in the soil and ultimately helps add resiliency to climate change. It will make your plants love you. Personally, I have the space for the recommended size of a compost pile, which is 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. I'm going to talk about what I have, because it's what I know. But if you want to know more about any of the other ways and sizes and means to make compost, you should get this book, Compost City by Rebecca Louie. It's easy to read and understand. It's extremely helpful to learn about the ins and outs of compost and different techniques. So yeah, if you don't think you can do what I'm doing here, that doesn't mean you can't compost. You can. I promise you can. Your composting journey is just going to look a little different than mine, but it's still going to be awesome. I guarantee it. As a general principle, the larger the pile, the hotter and quicker it turns into compost, but it's also harder to turn. More on that in a little bit. The larger you go. At 3 feet by 3 feet, you can turn the pile manually by yourself as needed. So you start with your empty 3 foot by 3 foot square. You can start by adding browns. Now, what are browns? Browns are your carbon-rich materials. This could be your dead leaves, pine needles, twigs, wood chips, shredded cardboard, shredded paper, dried cut grass, or leaves. Then once you have a good layer of browns, like 4 inches or so, you begin to add your greens. Now, what are your greens? These are your nitrogen-rich materials, pretty much everything else that's in your yard waste that isn't already a brown. Recently spent flowers, fresh cut grass, fresh cut leaves, food waste, aged manure. You layer the greens on top of the browns and then the browns on top of the greens. You're building a lasagna, a tasty, tasty earth lasagna made out of and made for your plants. When you're first building your compost pile, you should spray down each layer, especially the dry brown layer. Moisture is the third most important thing about compost, and it's honestly the most difficult part for me. I live in high desert in the western United States. It's dry and it's hot out here, so my compost tends to dry up, especially in the summer. Other places that get enough rain or have a high enough humidity aren't going to need to worry about moisture as much as I do. When it does dry out, it stops composting actively, and I have to kind of restart the process, kick it back into gear. The ideal moisture level for compost is that of a wrung-out sponge. It should be slightly moist to the touch, but not dripping wet. So far, we have our browns, and then our greens, and then our water. But at what mixture? General rule of thumb is 4 parts brown to 1 part green. But I've seen plenty of material that says 3 parts brown and 1 part green. I was even looking at some material this morning that said 2 parts brown and 1 part green. Clearly, it's not an exact science. I don't measure it at all. I just build the pile, sticking roughly to that 4-to-1 rule, and watering it in between each layer. Then, once you have it all built, you just have to wait. That's right, now you just wait. It can take a couple of days, but the pile begins to heat up to some astonishing temperatures. You see all the microorganisms are blitzing this pile and having a feast and participating in extreme amounts of procreation. We're talking about Bacchanalian levels of partying, and it gets messy and hot and very steamy. We want the temperature to get above 135 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 3 days. And this temperature shouldn't exceed 165 degrees for very long. It sounds difficult and sciencey, but it really isn't all that hard. Once the pile gets too hot, you turn it and you let out the heat. Once it gets too cold, you add greens and you turn it again to get it warm. There I go again, saying turning, not explaining myself. Well, maybe you're not an idiot like me, and maybe you figured it out by now. Turning the piles when you use a pitchfork or a compost fork to, well, turn the pile over. Starting from the top and working your way down, flip the material over onto itself. It doesn't need to be perfect, but the idea is to redistribute the heat and to introduce fresh air for the aerobic microorganisms. If you have the room, a great way to do this is to have multiple compost bins. Turn your compost in the empty bin once it cools down. If the center of your compost cools down to 90 degrees and the pile still hasn't finished, you must turn the pile. The microorganisms slow down at these temps, and so does the decomposition of the pile. To make sure that everyone in the compost party is still having a good time, use a long stem thermometer to monitor the temperature. Try to keep the temperatures between 90 and 140 degrees, with 130 to 135 being the best range. Don't let the pile get to temperatures above 140 for very long. These temperatures are too hot for most of the beneficial organisms to survive. There are many different takes on when a compost is ready. If you turn the compost and it doesn't heat back up and there's no more visible food scraps or solid greens, you're getting pretty close to it being ready. Set the compost aside in a new area to let it cure for around 4 weeks. The finished compost pile should be about 1/3 of the original size. A well-maintained compost pile usually finishes in about 3 months. I've heard some people say that they can finish a 3-foot by 3-foot pile in 1 month, just by turning it every single day. A neglected pile, however, once constructed and never turned, could take a year or longer to decompose all the way into compost. Finished compost has the nickname Black Gold for a reason. It's extremely precious. It does take work and a little patience to create, but the results are well worth it. Finished compost smells like the freshest soil you have ever smelled, and it is loose and it is crumbly. Most of the original material should be decomposed beyond recognition. Sift out any of the uncomposted twigs, shells, or fruit pits. Add them to your next compost pile. Add the finished compost to your garden beds or container gardens. Mix it in with your potting soil for your indoor plants. Use it as in-ground soil amendment or on top of the soil in your lawn. It is a superfood. It is a superfood for your super plants. So there you have it, start to finish. Compost. If you have any questions, leave a comment. If you think I got something wrong, leave a comment and subscribe. I'm sure I'm going to get more things wrong in the future, and I'm going to need people like you to help set me straight.